Our next step is to get our power supply ready for production. So we'll take this out of the bag and untwist the cable tie. We want to cut the end off about 8 to 12 inches from the connector. And we need to save this connector because we're going to be using this again. So there's about 8 inches, and we will cut it off. Okay, so we cut the wire this way and pull it a little apart. We cut off about 1/2 inch on one side to make it shorter. That's where your goggles come in. And then we're going to strip. I should use the correct stripper. This is about 24 gauge wire. So we're going to strip 1/4 inch, just a little bit of each of these. Okay, and the next step is to solder. I'm going to weigh this down, clean the iron on the sponge, and put a dab of solder on the iron. That solder is going to conduct heat to the wire, and then I try to melt the solder onto the wire, not onto the iron, but onto the wire. And I'll go to the next one. Heat up the wire and melt the solder so it adheres to the wire. Next step, let's go into your box. Actually, before we do that, let's figure out the polarity of these. Which one of these is positive and which one is negative? To do that, we need to plug it in. Plug in the power supply. Okay. Turn on the meter to the voltage setting. It's reading DC volts now, right? And we're going to measure the voltage between these two ends. And I need to hold them on. And what I see here, can you read the numbers on the meter? Is 12 volts. So the long one is positive. If you have the polarity reversed, then you'll get a negative reading, minus 12 volts. And so that says, again, this black one is negative relative to the red one. So long wire is positive. I'm going to solder a red wire onto that one and solder a black wire onto the other one. So I'll go into the box here and get red and black. I'm going to cut these in half. This is a finer wire, so we'll strip it on the finer setting. Just taking off 1/4 inch, more like 1/8 of an inch, 2 or 3 millimeters. And the same thing we want to do. You need to come closer. Is we're going to get solder into these wires. First melt the solder onto the soldering iron. If you can't get solder to stick onto the soldering iron, it certainly isn't going to go anywhere else. This iron is acting, oh, sorry, the iron is unplugged because I unplugged the soldering iron in order to plug in the power supply. And that's why my soldering iron's cold. So let's try this again. Give the iron a little bit of time to warm up. Okay, the soldering iron I think is hot now. Sure enough, I can melt solder onto it. I have a nice ball of molten solder. And so we said that the long one is positive. I'm going to take the red. Switch hands. And, oh, I didn't get solder onto the red yet. Okay. So next step is to get solder into this wire. So I'm going to use my finger here to get it up in the air. I'm going to heat up the tip of the wire with the molten solder and then melt solder into the wire. Let's do the black one. Okay. I'm going to heat up the wire from the tip and melt the solder onto the wire. There it goes. So now there's solder in both these wires. Now we said the long one was positive, so I'll make that red. I line up the two wires next to each other, and with that little dab of solder on the soldering iron, all I need to do is touch them. If I blow, they cool off quicker, and that's a good solder. Let's do the black one. Line them up and touch both of them so the solder melts and adheres to them. So now we have two terminals on the end of our cable, and we can double check our polarity. Once again, I have to unplug my soldering iron, plug in the power supply, and hopefully we did things right. Red is positive, black is negative, and we did it backwards. Oh no, I'm holding my leads backwards. Red to red, black to black, and now we have positive. 12.22 volts. The last thing we can do is plug this into our solderless breadboard. Now I have another solderless breadboard here whose backing has been ripped off, so you can see which holes are connected how. The two long top and bottom rows are all connected. All those holes are connected to each other. And then A through E and F through J are each connected to each other. So we can plug the red into positive, the black into negative, and if we measure anywhere along here from positive to negative, we should see the 12 volts anywhere along there. You certainly don't want to connect red and black into the same row because that would be shorting them out, and the power supply would be most unhappy.